So hello and welcome everybody to our panel discussion today titled New Technologies in Health Sciences Publishing, Catalysts or Disruptors. I'm Francesca Brazzarotto, the Customer Engagement Manager at Karger and one of the organizers of this event. I'm particularly excited today as this marks the second installment of Karger's new series of events called Karger in Conversation. And we are thrilled to have a fantastic lineup of speakers join us from the US, Italy, the UK, and Austria. For those of you who didn't attend our first event, this series will be a quarterly occurrence, bringing together experts from the publishing industry, librarians, information specialists, and researchers worldwide. The aim is to discuss the latest trends and topics in scholarly publishing. Today's topic is on point as we explore themes like AI and new technologies, and we'll be questioning whether these emerging technologies are actually propelling positive change or causing disruption. And we aim to provide you with practical examples of how these technologies affect the everyday work of researchers, librarians, and publishers. Our goal here is to equip you with some tools and some ideas that can help you navigate and utilize these advancements effectively. So before we dive in, I just want to give you a couple of rules, so a bit of a housekeeping. So this event will be recorded and made available to you afterwards. We have quite a few people that registered today, but I understand that not everybody could attend. So we want to ensure that those who cannot attend today or that can only partially attend today can watch it later on at their convenience. So feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat or in the question box that you can see on your screen. And I'll monitor them and we'll address them to our panelists at the very end. And lastly, you will receive an email from us either today or tomorrow, allowing you to share your feedback. Most importantly, you can advise us on what topics you would like us to cover in future sessions, ensuring that we can cover all your knowledge needs in the future. So there's been a small change in today's panel as our CEO, Daniel Ebneter, could not attend because unfortunately he has fallen ill. So today we have a very special guest moderating the session is Karger's Head of Academic and Research Markets, Chris Box. And we also have another special guest, Patrick from Image Twin. So Chris Box, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Fran. Just want to extend my welcome to everyone joining today. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation and a really interesting discussion. I should say, I'm the standing moderator, and I would say I'm not an expert in AI, but I don't think you need to be an expert in AI to understand the significance of it on today's society and the expectations for the impact on future society. It has massive potential, as we can all see, but I guess with that potential, let's say, comes a range of hopes and fears, I guess. Hopes, of how it will really significantly improve the everyday lives of people, but perhaps some fears about how it potentially could have a detrimental impact. But certainly from my perspective, I think one of the challenges with AI is always that a lot of the conversation at the moment feels potentially sometimes abstract, in that trying to understand exactly how it applies in my everyday world and my area of work and my everyday life perhaps is sometimes more difficult. And so I'm really happy that we're joined by a panel of experts today who've got a range of expertise on this topic and some really a good understanding of how it could impact on health science publishing in general. So I'm really interested to hear what they've got to say, and what I'll do now is just introduce them all to you, and then we'll lead on to the discussion. So our first panelist is Michelle Kraft. Michelle is the Library Director for the Cleveland Clinic Health System. Michelle not only coordinates access to library resources for a vast network of hospitals and outpatient facilities, but is also the co-editor of co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Medical Library Association. Her expertise extends to the impact of technology on healthcare and librarianship, with a special focus on generative AI in research, as evidenced by her policy and guidelines for JMLA authors. So welcome, Michelle. Next up, we have Dr. Francesca Andrea Calcio, a practicing medical doctor, pursued a PhD in public health and basic sciences at Sacred Heart University in Rome. His research focuses on personalized prevention, digital health, and artificial intelligence. And Andrea has recently founded the Italian Society for Artificial Intelligence in Medicine to advocate for healthcare workers' involvement in the upcoming AI revolution in medicine. So welcome, Andrea. Next is Dr. Phil Jones. a seasoned technologist, entrepreneur, and strategic analyst. Currently serving as the co-founder for digital and technology at the More Brains Cooperative. He's a scholarly kitchen chef, a member of the Learned Publishing editorial board, a member of the Researcher to Reader Advisory Board, and a judge of the Karger Vesalius Innovation Awards. And speaking of the Vesalius Innovation Awards, for those of you that don't know, it's an award presented each year by Karger and recognises and celebrates outstanding achievements in medical innovation, providing a platform for startups and young entrepreneurs in the healthcare field to showcase cutting-edge ideas and advance the future of science. And in relation to that, we have a special guest with us, as Fran mentioned, Patrick Stark, who was one of the recipients of last year's Vesalius Innovation Award winner. Patrick's the co-founder and CEO of Image Twin, a company dedicated to automated detection of image integrity issues in academic papers. His expertise lies in supporting publishers, universities, and scientists worldwide in maintaining the quality and integrity of scientific work. So welcome everyone to the panel. And yeah, as Fran mentioned, I think it's a really nice cross-section of the different areas that we are interested to talk about. But perhaps we kick off the discussion, first of all, thinking about what the landscape looks like in general. So I'd be really interested to get your views on this first question, really. The question goes, I think, let's start by summarising what we're talking about when we discuss AI and new technologies in the scholarly publishing and library world. Perhaps you could define some of the key terms and concepts related to AI in this context, and if you can offer a brief overview of emerging technologies in the library and publishing sectors, I think that would be great. And perhaps, Michelle, if we could come to you first on this topic.
Yeah, great. I think there's a lot of, there are so many AIs out there that it's hard to keep track of. I think the most that people know about is ChatGPT, but if people just limit their focus to that kind of AI, they're really limiting themselves overall. There are large language learning modules like ChatGPT, but then there are other AIs out there that are used for parsing data, crunching information, and then also helping people create data charts and things like that. So all of those combined can actually create and help with somebody when they're publishing the results of their research. The big thing what we always want to talk about, though, and we'll probably get into it more, is transparency and the use of those tools. They're tools, they're not actually meant to write your entire paper or do your entire research. One of the things that AI does a really good job of is gathering and sorting the information or the data, but we still need the human people to actually analyze the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, yeah, perhaps captures the excitement, but the concerns as well that we need to be aware of with AI. Just going around the room. Thanks, Michelle. Perhaps, Andrea, we could come to you next.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be here. And I will follow up on what Michelle said, because I think she really mentioned the game changer here. I mean, when we discovered ChatGPT 1 year ago, I think our life changed. Honestly, today I have a difficult time imagining my life without ChatGPT. But as she said, there's so much more. Even in the field of large language models, I use on a daily basis Consensus and Elicit. There are two different large language models that are trained specifically for researchers to search scientific databases, produce references, and quote academic papers and summarize them in a way that they don't have to actually go through all the papers they wish they could, because I mean, we're humans after all, but they get some help from these large language models that are trained to do that. And whereas ChatGPT is really good and it's trained on a huge amount of data to do many tasks, there are some LLMs that can do that specifically. And today you can even build your own GPT using ChatGPT 4. And that opens infinite possibilities for people who have entrepreneurship and some spirit of initiative. So yes, we have really interesting times ahead of us.
Great. I mean, I think as we're going through, there are going to be so many questions to ask, but I think I'll go around the whole panel first of all before we start to drill into some of those questions. Phil, perhaps we could come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. As Michelle and Francesco pointed out, a lot of the excitement, a lot of the hype right now is because of ChatGPT and the splash that it made. As Francesco said, it's almost exactly a year today that was launched. Now, what was interesting about it at the time is that it was capable of producing much more readable, much more human-like responses than people were used to seeing from computer-generated text. That's what caused a lot of the fear that, you know, the machines were coming for us and it was properly intelligent and all the rest of that. Much of that fear was, of course, entirely overblown. It's just doing an impersonation of what human language reads like and you know, and sounds like, I suppose. So it's yeah, so it can respond in a much more human-like way, and it has much more consistent style over multiple paragraphs. So that was quite innovative, but also it was quite a marketing coup, because the reason I say that is because large language models, the transformer model, was actually developed back in 2017. It was folks at Google and the University of Toronto who did so, and that itself was sort of an evolution of natural language processing and part of a broader field of generative AI. So it wasn't that this stuff suddenly appeared last year. It's been sort of baking for quite a long time. So NLP, for example, natural language processing, has been important in publishing and the scholarly supply chain for a bit. There's some publishers and some startups have been using things like machine learning and NLP to do things like summarizing content, synthesize information, and some of that has been recognized in the Vesalius Awards. That's why we have sort of Patrick in the room here, right? So this stuff isn't new. It's been going on for some time and it's been evolving for some time. So in terms of the sort of library and broader sort of scholarly comm space, technologies for discovery have been getting smarter and smarter and smarter over time. Learning algorithms are getting better at recommending content. People might need and accelerating things like desk research and the sort of data analysis that Michelle was talking about and all those sorts of different things. Some of those advances have been a little bit of a double-edged sword at times, and I'm sure we're going to sort of get into that, some of the disadvantages of those things during sort of the conversation. But one thing I'd like to flag, one area that I think is making really big strides but doesn't get enough attention, is in research assessment, impact tracking, and research graphs. This is perhaps, you know, moving a little bit out of the conventional scholarly supply chain into things like policy and research assessment and the research office. But there's a lot of progress going on around things like shared information infrastructure and clever approaches to connecting components of the scholarly record together, sort of understand the relationships between funding, institution, researchers, data, outputs, and all the downstream impact like medical advances and economic benefit and so on and so forth. That's going to be a really important area, I think, as business models for publishers evolve over the next few years.
Yeah, that's interesting. It opens a whole kind of sphere of avenue of conversation, I think. But just before we move on, because you mentioned them, and Phil, if you'd rather perhaps anyone else wants to answer this, but you mentioned NLP, you mentioned LLM, you mentioned generative AI. Would it be possible, perhaps for our listeners, maybe just to differentiate those things, just loosely what we're talking about by those three different things? And if you feel comfortable to answer that, I think I would find that interesting. I'm sure.
Yeah. So NLP, it's not entirely separable because LLMs in actual fact use NLP in several parts of how they work. But sort of broadly, NLP, natural language processing, is it's the art and the science of taking unstructured human language, you know, which is what we're communicating in now, just a string of words which our brain then interprets and gives structure to, taking that and turning it into structured data that a computer can understand, and then also taking that structured data, perhaps doing some kind of transformation, and then turning it back into human language that a person can read. And that sort of unstructured to structured and structured to unstructured types of conversions have been going on for a long time. There are, you know, techniques like word frequency analysis and semantic tagging and those sorts of things that have been about for a while. What LLMs do, which was different, is what they do is that you give them a string of words, a string of tokens is what they're called, and it uses a clever black box machine learning algorithm to predict what the most likely word is to come next in that string of words. That's a very different approach to what the traditional natural language generation model is doing. It's not a direct transformation of structured data into language. Instead, it's a predictive approach, the same sort of way that you know, the autocorrect on your phone or the predictive text on your phone sort of works. So they're very different sort of ideas, even though they can be used to do some similar sorts of use cases, because one is about structural transformation and the other one is about modeling language and predicting what a likely plausible word to come next is. Now, there's a lot more around the machine learning and the training and the reinforcement learning that's done to make these things conform to certain use cases. And maybe we can dig into that during the conversation. But if I went into all of that, it would probably take me about half an hour to sort of break it all down. I have a talk that I give about how that all works, but it's far too long to give in this segment, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a topic where there's so many, you can go to such a great degree of depth of those. So that was really helpful. Patrick, perhaps we could come to you last as well, just on the general topic of the landscape of AI in and AI technology in the publishing landscape. I mean, you work you set up a technology company, so I guess you have a view on this. And yeah, perhaps you could give us a summary of how you see it at the moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. So as spoken before, there are a lot of about languages. So there are a lot of progress in the last years, and I think that's very helpful, especially if you're not like a native speaking person in English, for example. It could be very beneficial to have software like ChatGPT help you to make sentence, which you would maybe not do otherwise. And there's also for images, you can create them there, software like Midjourney, Dolly, where you can artificially create images. I think we all saw them in the news if they're like politicians or famous people where we just made up images. But we also have the other side, the intricate part, where we have to see, okay, how can we find out if something is made up, if something is AI generated? And I think that's also a very important part. And this is where you can use software like Authenticate, for example, to look into is something AI generated or not. And we are working on like something different, similar, but for images. So to look if an image is originally, if everything is okay, if it's manipulated. And we use AI software, we use AI technology to validate images for their authenticity, if everything is okay, if they are reused somewhere. And I think this is a different use case of AI technology, that you can use it to like detect fraud and detect issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess that's the comparison between the creation of language or text in the first instance, but then the application of it to actually try and identify whether that text was generated by an artificial intelligence in the first place. So, okay, that's great. I mean, I think that gives us a good flavor of the kind of landscape, but perhaps we now start to move on to think about, we called this topic balancing innovation and ethical considerations. I guess this is where we the kind of balance between opportunity and challenge. So, Andrea, perhaps we could come to you first on this question. So I think, now that we've seen what we're dealing with, in broader terms, what do you see as the key opportunities and challenges associated with generative AI for research, particularly in terms of extraction and classification in scientific and medical research?
Thank you, Chris, for your question. And I'm particularly glad that you're asking me this question, because I truly think that AI is supposed to change the way in which we do our work, and specifically large language models or LLMs, such as ChatGPT or Consensus or Elicit or the ones we mentioned today, really provide a good example for that. Like for ChatGPT, if you have the plus ChatGPT version, ChatGPT 4, which can be accessed by paying a monthly fee, researchers can write the research question, ask the LLM to search the internet for information, including scientific databases. But that's something I mentioned before. But what I didn't say, and what is mostly a problem with ChatGPT, is that these LLMs do not understand their output. So with what they write, you should be careful and double check every time, and not publish your research and the output of these large language models without a careful analysis of their statements. And this is particularly true when it comes to referencing other people's work. Checking sources is as relevant as it is when you're consulting great literature and social media, because the way that these LLMs are structured is based on the tokenization of the content they digest, rather than on the comprehension we would expect from a human agent. I will not dive deeper into this And I hope that the technical people don't get mad at me for the oversimplification that I'm making, but this is how these machines work. And another example of concept extraction or classification in scientific or medical research is the upload of a database in ChatGPT, which is really helpful if you're trying to make a quick query on some large database, or if you want to put your thoughts in words rather than elaborate code to query the database. But it's really not a safe option, because everything that you upload on these large language models, unless it's a really specifically programmed large language model that takes care of the privacy and of your data, everything gets uploaded on the central database, so to say. Because these LLMs are AI solutions that adopt machine learning and deep learning techniques, and the documents and data you upload are sort of fed into the algorithm and become part of it, you are exposing any sensitive data that you upload on this platform to being queried by other external agents. And this has happened already. There's already been experiences of data leaks from major companies because some employees had uploaded some secret documents on ChatGPT, just asking for a summary or to rewrite some sentences. And then some other some rival companies, agents, have queried these information from these documents from ChatGPT directly, or in extreme cases, they can even download the document. So you should always be careful with the data that you upload on ChatGPT, and you should always pay extreme attention to the way that you use the sources. That's also true for what you put in and for what comes out of it. You should always be very, very careful.
Mm-hmm. And that leads us quite nicely onto a next question I was going to ask, actually. But just before we do, I mean, I think that general point that you're saying, which about, it offers such potential to give you an answer on any question, but I think you almost need to be qualified in sometimes to understand if that answer is correct. I've heard about this idea of, I think they call them hallucitations, where it accidentally references the wrong piece of work. But don't ask me why, but I recently asked ChatGPT to describe open access publishing in the form of a haiku. And it gave me one straight away, which was great. I couldn't write a haiku myself, but I could also tell that the language in it was slightly loaded, and I wouldn't know that if it weren't a topic that I was familiar with. And so, yeah, I think it's a really, sort of perhaps expresses those two sides quite nicely to it. But I think you were touching a lot there on the idea also kind of what you should add to a large language model, let's say. And we start to have these questions around things like privacy and copyright as well. And this was the next question we wanted to come to, really. Perhaps, Phil, we could address this question to you. And the question goes, when it comes to utilizing LLMs in health sciences publishing, how do you perceive the risks related to privacy and copyright, and what measures can be implemented to ensure effective privacy protection?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When it comes to privacy and copyright, I think it's important to separate the two because they are two different issues, although there is some obvious sort of overlap and interrelational aspects to that. So in terms of privacy, I mean, Francesca put it very well, Andrea put it very well there, about the fact that there is a risk when you're using something that's on the open web, like ChatGPT. If you just type something into it or copy and paste something into it, it goes off into the internet, it goes off to that server, and you have no idea and no control over what happens to it. So whether it gets folded into the primary model or whether it gets used for reinforcement learning or whatever happens to it technologically, it doesn't really matter. Basically, you're handing over information to somebody else and you lose control of what happens to it there. So that's something to be very very careful of. There are ways of protecting yourself from that, as I think has already been mentioned. These technologies are built on open source code, and it's possible to download that code and implement it yourself and make your own version of it and then train it. That has other advantages as well, because you may not necessarily need the full-blown large language model. You may want a smaller language model that's based on your own content or whatever is dependent on, you know, whatever use case you have. But the point of it is then you have control of the infrastructure, and you have control over the technology, you have control over the data and that sort of thing. And there are certainly companies, publishers included, which are developing their own implementations of these language models of various sizes, tuned for various use cases, so on and so forth. As a smaller publisher, obviously that might be a little bit of a challenge, but that's where I think sort of collaborating and working together and partnerships sort of really sort of comes into that. So that's how I would sort of think about that. In terms of copyright, from the point of view of published content, there's an awful lot of concern about, you know, large language models, including GPT, taking that published content and repackaging it and pushing it out again. I am a lot less concerned about that than I think a lot of folks are. And the reason why I'm not all that concerned about it, certainly from a publisher business point of view, is that a lot of the value that publishers bring is around dissemination and accreditation, discovery, so on and so forth. And once you take that content out of that context, it becomes much less valuable. So I don't think it's an imminent threat to the business model in the way that a lot of people think it is. Where I do see a risk is in the lack of consistency of policy internationally. So, for example, in the US, I believe the current position is that AI-generated outputs can't be copyrighted at all, whereas in the UK, they can, and the copyright is assumed to be held by the operator of the AI. So with that level of uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty over the copyright status of AI-generated content, that makes it very difficult for a company or a university or a library or whoever, you know, to come up with its own policies and responses. So I think that that perhaps what we need is some, you know, is much more coordination and much more perhaps advocacy to get, you know, to encourage policymakers and governments and legal folks to have some consistency and sort of reach some sort of consensus around how to do it. I think a reason why that's a concern is that's why we're seeing a lot of the aggressively conservative approaches that some publishers are adopting, you know, for example, banning the use of generative AI outright, when in actual fact it could have some very useful applications around inclusion and diversity, helping people who perhaps don't write or speak English as a first language, all sorts of positive, beneficial things. And unless we sort of get ahead of it, sort of regulatory wise and policy wise, it's going to be difficult to take you know, to take an approach because of the uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Just a kind of a follow-up question to that, I guess. You know, I think, is it fair to say that a lot of the conversation when we talk about large language models, we almost use ChatGPT as shorthand for what we mean when we're talking about large language models? And yeah, I guess we would see at the moment ChatGPT is not, let's say, a bad player, you know, in the sense that, you know, but is one of the challenges in trying to set policy for those kind of things is that you have to consider the kind of worst people in the market, if you like, in terms of trying to understand. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, and whether, am I wrong in saying that ChatGPT has become shorthand? Is it a fair shorthand for large language models?
No, I think you're right. It's most of the conversations that I've been involved with, the ChatGPT and large language models are used interchangeably. In actual fact, ChatGPT is a specific implementation of one large language model that is tuned for one specific use case. And what large language models are capable is far, far broader than that. So it does harm the conversation in that way. It also limits the scope of the conversation because there are all sorts of other things that can be done with these things that, you know, that we aren't talking about. And I think that doesn't help in terms of policy making because there's a lack of comprehension about what these technologies are capable of doing. So I think, yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge. Whether I would classify OpenAI as a particularly bad player in the space, I'm not sure that I would. I think they have been a little less open about their training data than some of the other models, but some of that is partly defensive because they're concerned about lawsuits and litigation and so on and so forth. Yeah, and of course, right now, of course, we don't know what's happening with the soul of OpenAI because it's quite in flux, you know, as of last weekend when they had some pretty significant changes in governance.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've been reading in the news about this, but just on this topic of kind of opportunity and concern as well. And we're talking there about privacy and copyright. Michelle, I'm just interested to get your perspective as a I guess, like the, you know, you're called kind of custodians of trusted information at your institution. And I think, you know, increasingly advisors to researchers, let's say, on what they are and aren't allowed to do with content. I hope that's a kind of like fair reflection on some of the things that are expected or perspective of librarians these days. Just would be really interested to get your views from that perspective and any other opportunities and concerns that perhaps you wanted to raise from the librarian perspective.
Well, one of the areas that we are concerned about copyright is and how they are. There's a question about the copyright. While I understand Phil in talking about the stuff that is generated from the AI isn't copyrightable depending upon where you live, we are concerned about the content that's being taken that is copyrighted, because once you take that content that's copyrighted and you change it or you've moved it or you've done it, what's the real source? What is who is responsible for that information? And we've had examples, many examples of AI hallucination. You talked about how it was making up citations to articles. It would actually take, kind of like Phil mentioned, your autocorrect on your cell phone. It was doing that at a larger scale, where it would take a subject, create a title, then create and use a legit journal title, and then actually just build a citation using all legit pieces of information, but completely creating an entirely new citation. So when you combine that with the copyright concerns about it taking information and using it, and it's not attributable to who it really belongs to, that becomes a concern regarding how we use that information. Is it good information? Is it suspect information? And how do we cite it and how do we utilize it? There are a lot of, one of the things, you know, like we were talking about with ChatGPT and how it could be, you know, refer to everything, and concerns about the content that it's in, it doesn't find things behind firewalls. So how is it finding the articles that you are asking it to find? How is it finding the chapters and the ebooks if that content is behind a firewall? It is either going and making it up, or it's synthesizing the data from the abstract that's freely available, or it's finding it on pirate sites, which again is another concern. You can create large language models that are specifically for a topic or thing. Like, for example, Biomed LM is a domain-specific LLM for biomedicine. So they've actually made this large language model, and it only searches biomedical literature. So those are some of the ways that we can utilize it. The National Library of Medicine is already using AI and to index help it use a algorithm to index its articles that are in PubMed that for people who are doing research. So that's helpful. The AI isn't exactly awesome right now. We've found, many medical librarians have found a lot of instances in which the indexing using that AI is not super great. So we're hoping that we can work with the National Library of Medicine to train the AI a little bit better, to train its algorithms a little bit better. But there are a lot of other ways that people are using it in publishing. Just simply researchers alone are using it when they're doing systematic reviews, which can actually take thousands of articles, and to write this review, they're using systematic review tools to actually help with the inclusion and exclusion criteria as they go through all of the results that they have downloaded. So it's using an AI, and you're customizing the content that it's finding or that it's using in its data. And that's a really strong way of using AI, is being able to take that AI and have the content that you know is in that black box. I think one of the concerns that we all have with some of the AIs that are publicly available is we don't know what's in that black box, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the copyrighted and everything else. So those are some of the examples that you could see how it's being used in libraries and in publishing. One really good example is Iris AI. The University of Helsinki Library actually has an AI that they collaborate with to enhance the research and discovery operations for this students and researchers and librarians. So there's a lot of opportunities there, but yeah, you're right. The copyright does get concerning, and it really got concerning when OpenAI published their statement that said anybody who's getting facing legal action due to copyright issues, that OpenAI would help support that. And I'm like, so a lot of people kind of got a little nervous on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that's really interesting. And I think, on this topic, Patrick, maybe we could come to you as well, because I guess from your perspective, as a kind of someone who's founded a company, which has an interest in utilizing AI, I mean, I guess in some ways, the issue of copyright and making something too restrictive is a problem in terms of being able to develop new opportunities. And so, I don't know, do you have a kind of perspective on that? So about how much of a challenge you see in being able to exploit the potential that can come from OpenAI by being too restrictive with policy, and whether that's been an issue for you so far, and whether you have any perspectives on the topic in general, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously that's an important question. And on the one side, you have laws against it, or like from governments who say you are not allowed to do certain things. But on the other side, you have internally in a company who say these are our guidelines. And for example, if you talk about is there a bias? So if we include metadata, and then we might have a bias based on country, language, other parameters, how can we make sure this is not going to happening? And so this is a very, very important question. And for us also, who will make the final decision? So can an AI ever be able to make a decision, or is it always to be a human? And how can we combine these two aspects? So if we talk about images, for example, the fraud case is getting way more sophisticated. It's no easy copy and pasting anymore. Images are manipulated. Paper mills are very advanced. And AI can help you here making some search on a big scale. It's fast. It can compare millions of papers within seconds. But a human can only put something into context and look into the details. And important is how can we combine these two together. And from our experience and our strong belief is an AI can only give like a recommendation, but can never make a final decision. This is always something to be made by a human, and this is something which we always try to make very clear in the communication, that we only have probability. So we can say this is a very likely case of fraud, but we can never guarantee that's the case, and the human has always to make the final decision, because there are massive consequences if there are allegations coming out and they're incorrect afterwards. So I think that's always, because it might happen that the software would say, we are pretty sure that this is a problem, but it's not in the end because of context. And this is important, that you're always aware that AI can make a mistake. It's not perfect, will never be perfect. So in the end, it's always a human who has to make the final decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting topic. I've heard the one about whether AI can make a decision. I know the famous one is, I think if people are on trial, you don't want to be tried just before lunch, because apparently there's a really high case of people being found guilty before lunch. So you have to question human at times. But I guess the point you're making is that even though AI might be able to give you a very strong recommendation that might be, better than a human might be able to interpret it less potentially, it still needs human intervention, let's say, to confirm that decision should be applied or not. And I guess that comes down to, then the application of AI. And perhaps that leads us quite nicely on to the next topic, actually. I mean, I wish we could stay on all of these topics I think we could talk about them for a long time. But this question then, just trying to think a bit more kind of practically on a day-to-day basis, then just thinking about how you've actually seen some of those things being implemented. I think, Michelle, potentially you touched on some of these already as well, but we've seen the use of technologies from the point of view of the researcher and the industry as a whole. Can you give us a view on how libraries are adapting their services to support researchers in the age of emerging technologies? And are there any strategies for training researchers and librarians to effectively use AI tools and navigate new publishing platforms?
Well, right now it's so new. So there's a lot of, I feel like librarians and some of the researchers are still kind of just learning the landscape to learn what they need to learn, but librarians themselves have been working and looking at this kind of area, this landscape. You talk about prompt engineers. I like to think of the original prompt engineer as a librarian, because we get the actual person coming up to us at the desk saying, I need articles on this topic and this information. And we actually take the actual human person talking to me and typing it, especially medical librarians, because if you're searching the medical literature, you're using biomedical terminology, and people don't go, even doctors don't go around, speaking the biomedical terminology in the way that the computers understand. So in a way, I think of librarians as the OGs of prompt engineers. So we've been doing that for a while. It's just we are needing to take our skills up to a newer level to understand the AI side of prompt engineering. And sometimes it just happens to be the subject matter that which we're in. But like I said, with we're already working with the National Library of Medicine and PubMed. PubMed is indexing these articles, and we're working to understand how it is doing that so that we can provide better searching results, but then also help NLM to provide better indexing results, so that both work hand in hand together. As I mentioned earlier, we use these systematic review tools. Distiller and Covenants are products that and a couple other systematic review products take those resources, all the articles that we've downloaded, and then work to create a learning pattern of what the reviews, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria were, so that they float the results that are more likely to be included to the top, so that people are seeing the good stuff first. As you mentioned, like, you don't want to go to a trial before lunch. When you're faced with thousands of articles for a systematic review, you really want to kind of get to the new ones first, or the good ones first. So those are some of the ways that I think we're using it. I think other ways that we're starting to use it is that we're just even getting our fingers into it. And that's important as well, because you have to understand how it's being used so that you can help others. When ChatGPT exploded onto the market, I can tell you, I had many, many doctors who were asking it and querying it for research. And then they were coming up with these citations that were all hallucinations, and they're hitting us. And we didn't even, at the beginning, we didn't know this was a thing. And so just understanding and learning from that has been very helpful.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess, as you say, it's an early stage at the moment. So I think it's difficult for us to kind of accurately know on a day-to-day basis how you will be using those tools into the future. But just out of interest, if you were now setting the syllabus for a librarian degree, let's say, for someone just starting their course now, how much of a feature do you think AI needs to be? Is it something that shouldn't be on there at all, or is it actually something which would now dominate? I'm sure you won't answer it shouldn't be on there, but I'm just sort of curious to get your
I think it needs to have a beachhead. I think it needs to have a place. I think it needs to have an area when it comes to understanding how information is found. So there's a lot of areas in which that can be talked about within when people are getting their master's degree in library science. That's we go through indexing, we go through all sorts of different things in retrieval. So understanding AI and how it can be and how it impacts the results that you're finding, how you have to change your finding strategies to retrieve the things based on the AI that you're using. That's very important. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed and trained and taught in school. Depending upon the person themselves, they may want to go down a whole nother line and start creating AI products, working for Patrick, but I definitely think at the very beginning, it's understanding how the information is found is the big thing.
I guess the really interesting question that I don't think we've got time to answer now, but I'd love to know at some point, is that if you do add a focus on AI into a librarian degree, what's no longer relevant that gets dropped off the syllabus? What has AI replaced something within a librarian's role? But I think that's a really difficult question. I don't think it's quite fair to point it at you now, but it's just a kind of I think, librarians and information, so closely linked, it's always interesting to hear, perspectives from that. So, Phil or Patrick, any sort of reflections on this kind of like day-to-day use with, perhaps, I think, obviously, Phil, I know you will have been a researcher with you having a PhD, and Patrick, I'm sure you would have spent some time as well. But I mean, for a researcher, how much of a role do you think you could see the librarian helping researchers in their day-to-day when we're thinking about publishing here? I mean, do you see the role of the librarian diminishing or increasing as a result of something like this?
I think increasing, to be honest with you. And so taking the longer views, I haven't been an active academic researcher for quite a while now. So I left and moved into sort of technology and publishing about sort of 6 or 7 years after my PhD. And when I was an academic, I was a physicist, and I'd never really worked within a university as such. I was in a government research agency originally at UK Atomic Energy Authority, and then I was in a hospital when I was working in Massachusetts. And so I didn't really have as much sort of contact with librarians, with university librarians. But in the disciplines that I worked, it was very much a case of you would do your own sort of research. Because very often there wasn't the skill base within the library in order to be able to support such specialist disciplines. But I think that is something that has dramatically changed over the past sort of couple of decades or so. And I think it's because the way that information systems have grown more complex that there's much more of a need for information specialists to be able to help researchers understand how to access information. So it's not so much about understanding the discipline as it is understanding the way that information is structured and the way that information is gathered. Now, I've got a little bit of an anecdote from a research project I did last year, and it's about PubMed. So this, I think, sort of builds on what Michelle was talking about there. So prior to 2022, when you searched in PubMed, it was a bit like searching in any other, it was exactly like searching in any other A&I index. So abstracting and indexing index, not artificial intelligence, A and I, not AI. So you put together this Boolean search query. Your prompt engineers in the library might help you with this. And it would say, Boolean search is, I want this word and that word, or this phrase, but not that, and you would sort of bolt it together, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then it would come back with a set of results. Now, the reason why that was, it was a thing, was because you needed a mechanism that you could sort of write down the protocol for how you did your systematic search. And if I typed it into my desktop, it would give me the same thing as if you typed it into your desktop. And that became a reproducible pipeline for you to be able to say something about what exists within the literature. And that's really important for things like assessing drugs and medical devices and all sorts of things around various aspects of research and business and all the rest of it. So really important aspect of what it is that is done in academia and amongst libraries. But in 2022, PubMed took a leaf out of more consumer grade search approaches, and they started contextualizing the results based on people's search history, what they were interested in, perhaps location, so on and so forth, the same way that Google does when you type something in. And that's great if you just want a quick answer. Where do I want to go for lunch for Italian food or something like that? That's fantastic for that. But if you want something that's systematic and can be reproduced by somebody else elsewhere, there are some problems there, because you'll get a different result depending on who you are. So I think that then creates a need for somebody to be able to understand the different use cases of various types of search, whether it's intelligent search or strictly Boolean search or some artificial intelligence assisted approach like the ones that Michelle was talking about, and then figuring out how that can then be used in a systematic way so that you still get this reproducible information chain. And I think when PubMed first made this change, a lot of librarians, or the ones I spoke to, were quite frustrated and annoyed about it because they didn't know how to make it reproducible again. And I think that's a really important area that is something that librarians can add a lot of value in.
Yeah. It being relevant to you is useful in one context, but it loses consistency for everyone who's looking at that in another sense, I suppose. And that kind of like touches quite nicely onto, unfortunately, it's the last question, because I want to keep then give some time for the audience to ask questions as well. But I think that sort of relates back to this question now. So the question is around quality control in relation to plain language summaries. So we're talking about summaries which are included in relation to, I think, a journal article usually, which are aimed at the general public or the non-specialist audience, I suppose. And, you know, so the question goes, you know, how much quality control is required for AI-produced plain language summaries, and what steps can be taken to assure accuracy and appropriacy of language and content? But it's quite interesting now to think about the point you were just making, Phil. It's that also different people might, in utilizing these softwares, get different answers. And how do you kind of determine what might be a good plain language summary? Andrea, I don't know whether that's a question you might be able to touch on, and the use of and creating plain language summaries in general, and how we can ensure quality control, so that, you know, particularly where we're communicating things to non-specialist audience, we can ensure outputs from these kinds of technology are trusted and reliable.
Thank you, Chris, for your question. I think it's really important that we face the issue of quality control when it comes to plain language summaries, and we should really define what the final goal of these plain language summaries is. Because if we are producing them for our own use, let's say I want to understand some text, some really complex matter that is really beyond my scope and my comprehension, then my suggestion would be to always double check the plain language summary with someone who is actually grasping the topic we're talking about. If it's instead a matter of some topic that we are actually we are really well aware of, but we are trying to summarize some really long and complex matter for someone else to understand, then I suggest that you are the one, or I am, in this case, I'm the one who's in charge of this control. Because as we have said over and over during this this webinar, large language models don't really understand what they say, and there's always the risk of misunderstanding, or as you call them, hallucitations, or if there's no citation, there's a hallucination. And we should always revise the text that you're reading. If you understand it, you should revise it yourself. If it's not within your understanding, then you should ask for someone from some human assistance. There should always be some human control to the output of an artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I guess, harks back to one of the topics earlier on. It's this point, and perhaps I think that Patrick was making, which was around still needing kind of human, I don't know if mediation is quite the right word, but it's confirmation that some of the points that they've come through which are correct. Patrick, just from your perspective, I guess you'd be familiar with plain language summaries, but I guess, you know, the company which you work for is not a subject specific, I don't think, unless I'm wrong on that. And so I guess the knowledge within your company would be more relying on the knowledge which exists out there that you can generate from these. I mean, do you have a kind of view on how you control quality for things which are aimed at non-specialist audience rather than specialist audiences?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because it's not really our field we are in. But yeah, it's like from our experience, if you have like AI models working on problems, in many cases it's very accurate, but there are always some odd cases where it really like sometimes gives like very not good answers. It's very rare cases, but it can happen. So it's tough if you just always believe what's coming out there. So it's really helpful if you have someone with some at least basic knowledge in the field. They can put it into context and say, yes, this is totally right, because maybe in 90% of the cases it's a very good summary, a very accurate one, but there are some cases where it's just necessary that you can put it into context. Otherwise, yeah, it might be challenging.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other challenge as well is that, you know, classically with academic topics is you can ask two different people and they'll give you a completely different view. Although I guess that's different than accuracy. I guess that's more whether it's correct or not. But I mean, Phil, any further points on that in relation to plain language summaries specifically?
Yeah, so absolutely. So quality assurance is, of course, as everybody said, it's really important. You can't just let the computer come out with its answer and then trust it and hope for the best, right? So you do have to apply quality assurance. We talked about how that is use case dependent, but it's also important to recognize how it's technology dependent as well, because they're not all plain language summaries or synthesized summaries use LLMs. There are several companies on the market that use ones that use natural language generation. Some of those that have been around for a while, I think SciencePod does it, and Scholarly does it, right? And they're not using LLMs, I don't believe, in their technology stack. It's natural language generation. Now, natural language generation, as I said before, is not about generating the next plausible word in the way that an LLM does, but instead it takes structured data and turns it into human readable language. The upside of that is it's far less likely to hallucinate, because it's basically doing a conversion of one data form into another. But it is also far less likely to create very readable, pleasant to read and understandable text. So experiments to create entire books that were done before LLMs out of NLG generated text created things which were really not very pleasant to read, not very readable, not easy to get along with. So the type of quality control depends on the technology. You know, is it are you more looking out for hallucinations and incorrect facts, or is it more about the quality of the text and the readability? And so what kind of processes you have to put it through depends how it's generated. And as things evolve and new types of technologies emerge, you know, the thing that comes after LLMs, whatever that may be, we'll have to think again about what kind of quality control we'll need, because the way it's generated will affect the sorts of risks that it poses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that, you know, in terms of the importance of how engaging the text is itself, you know, and how much people then trust it as a result. And I'm sure that's true with, you know, scientists writing it as well, just in general. You know, some of those are just better communicators than others, and how much of an impact that has in people, how much people trust. But I guess this is specific where we're talking about where we're trying to communicate to another audience. But yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I mean, I think this is one of them we could easily double, but I noticed Fran is back, and I think that's probably my cue that we should pause, because I think we're likely to have some questions from the room now. So, Fran,
yes.
perhaps
Yes, so we have a question that I think will connect to what Michelle was talking about earlier. This is by Jean-Francois in regard to the indexing of PubMed articles. Are mesh terms, and I think he's referring to the medical subject headings terms assigned using an AI tool, for example, Biomed LM? So,
well,
so
I can answer that.
Yeah, so
Biomed LM is not. Biomed LM doesn't really use doesn't assign mesh terms to PubMed. PubMed originally, there were actual people indexing using a very controlled vocabulary, the mesh, who would read all the articles and assign the terms. That is not practical given the amount of article content that is being generated and has been generated. So National Library of Medicine created a algorithm, and it wasn't an AI yet, but more like it was an algorithm to actually troll through the full text of the articles and assign terms based on the mesh terms. The algorithm then was self-learning, and it would learn as an LM would tweak it. Recently, now they're working with an AI to help with the self-learning of that algorithm. So it's a little confusing, it's a little layered, but it, in my opinion, and then I'm not speaking for the National Library of Medicine at all, it would be nice if they had more humans interacting with that AI algorithm and the, with the algorithm and the AI, because we're still seeing really not very good citations coming out. Like, for example, I did a search the other day on falls in the hospital, and I retrieved several articles having to do with falling rates of admission. So decrease of admissions, not the actual person falling. So those are some of the things that we're running into. But Biomed LM is not used, is not part of National Library of Medicine. They are actually, it's a different AI, I think from Stanford. I would have to double check that they're using it to look at the biomedical literature as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Then we have another question. What are the biggest challenges in terms of implementation of AI technologies in libraries, especially those which are part of a consortium and have to follow a common set of rules and their implications? Ooh, that's a that's a lot for Michelle, I think, but if anybody else also has a say in this.
Well, I'll say that right now the biggest challenges are firewalls. If I wanted to, the Cleveland Clinic has a partnership with IBM, and we've been approached, the library has been approached several times to create an AI for the library, and we are interested. However, we have to really discuss and figure out what is this AI going to do? We just can't, create an AI and let it go running around. If we wanted to mine the literature, we only have we have a lot, but we only have a select set of literature that we have access to. The rest of the world is unavailable to us unless it's open access, but there's a lot of good research that's behind firewalls. So how are we going to create this AI within the library that would aid in the searching and the desiloization of our actual resources? That's a discussion that is continually ongoing. I see us being able to use AI to actually come up with better front, and for lack of a better example, better front pages to your library experience. So when you're searching something, the AI goes through the resources that you have online and that you've actually, they might be in print, but you've made them like searchable online, and does a better job of retrieving what you want specifically that the library has access to on your front page. Right now, those discovery systems are really crummy. You really have to do a lot of data cleaning and curating, so that, for example, in a medical library, when you type in the word blood, you get the journal or a book with that in the title, and not a whole lot of junk that just shows up with blood. So I see AIs being able to be used in that kind of area as well.
Discovery
Maybe
has to
panelists
improve.
have other ideas.
Yeah, discovery has to improve, right? Because it's necessity is the mother of invention, and it's been a problem for a while. I mean, you're just talking about mesh terms and classification, and that to me is just a big bucket of category errors. And it's one of the things that's happened in academia generally over the past several decades is we've gone through this sort of transformation. Not so much in medical, but certainly in other disciplines, of moving away from discipline-based research, where a chemist does chemistry and a geographer does geography and all the rest of it, to problem-oriented research. So climate change or food security or things like that. So it's much more interdisciplinary. And when we look at classification models, whether it's mesh or whether it's the Web of Science classification terms or the FOR codes out of Australia, New Zealand, or any of these types of classification systems, they all sort of bundle discipline and disease and problem and all of these different things all together, and they're not separating them out in orthogonally as they should be. So the way in which we classify, the way in which we sort, and the way in which we process and discover things really has to improve. And I see that's going to be something that's going to change over the next sort of 5 or 10 years. You're going to see a lot of progress in that. And there are good places doing, and good companies and initiatives doing a lot of work around that sort of thing. One that's worth a look at is OpenAlex, which are basically getting a lot of open information of all the scholarly literature that they can, and then sort of combining them and processing them with AI to try to make things discoverable and much more interconnected. Also, the other aspect of it, if I can sort of go against the grain a little bit and almost speak against AI to a certain extent, is there is a little bit of a risk that when we use AI to, if you like, fill in the gaps of the metadata and create the connections, then we're almost using it as a sticking plaster to take the pressure off fixing that metadata where it should be fixed, which is upstream at the point of creation. So not only is it very exciting, but there's also a risk that as we use more AI to try and, you know, bandage it up, if you like, and try and extract information from what is a broken and fractured and disjointed landscape, the less pressure there is to actually fix that metadata and fix that information at source. So that is a bit of a caution, a note of caution that I would add to using AI to solve all of these problems.
Okay. Anybody else wants to add to that? I think the metadata question is another topic that we could spend a few hours on discussing. But Patrick or Francesco, do you want to add anything to that, or we can move to the next question? Okay. So another one by Jean-Francois. Regarding the issue raised by Phil on the lack of consistency of PubMed searches, are there workarounds? How can we be sure that our queries will intercept all the references that we are looking for?
Oh, that's definitely a Michelle question, because I'm not a practicing librarian, but I gather the answer is yes, that you can do things in the settings and stuff like that. But I'll let Michelle answer it because she'll know better than I do.
First of all, you're never going to get everything. I'm just going to say that right now. We can always hope to get as much as we can. There will always be things that escape for whatever reason. I would say working with your librarian, but my guess is you're a librarian asking this question because of the way you phrased it. But there are ways. I've been working with several librarians. I don't use PubMed as often when I'm trying to do actually a structured, reproducible search. I use other products that other products that use Medline. So you have the Medline content that's in PubMed. PubMed searches the Medline content along with things that aren't in Medline, and that's a whole other discussion for another time. But when I'm doing a systematic review or an IACUC search, which is the IRB for animals, which is for people, and I need the reproducibility and the ability to go back a year later, 10 years later, 6 months later, and reproduce that search and make sure it gets me the same results or added results due to the time, I don't use PubMed. I use Medline on a different database that actually allows for me to structure those resources in that way. And I can see my search strategy completely built out. It's saved at that way. PubMed does not do that. It just mushes it all together in one large search string. So if you have like for example, I have searches that have gone back 10 years, mesh changes. So if they updated a change in the medical subject headings, I can go in these databases, take that out, put that in very easily in the saved search that I have. Whereas PubMed, it mushes it together and it's not real easy to do it. So that's, unfortunately, that's my answer to that answer or that question.
Maybe if I could just ask a quick follow-on to this, because I mean, I guess, you know, Michelle, you were talking there about things which are very specific to health sciences, you know, areas around Medline and PubMed Central and things like that. We talked earlier on about ChatGPT potentially becoming a shorthand for large language models, let's say. You know, I think one of the things that people like about ChatGPT is you can ask it a question on any topic, you know, so you can, whatever it might be, on sports or health or etc. Do you have a sense of how the landscape's going to be developed from an AI perspective, particularly around large language models? I think around specialist databases versus general tools, let's say, and are you going to go to different places for different pieces of information? And is there one that's specific to high energy physics over here where you wouldn't ask ChatGPT? And I'm just interested to know whether we think AI large language models will become very specialized or whether more generalized as we move forwards. Who feels like answering that? maybe it's a too difficult question to ask. Andrea,
well, I can volunteer some information, or a go. I'll start things off at least. Yeah, so I mean, I think there will be more of these types of models emerging. There's this sort of concept of the small language model that you hear bandied about now, which is these sort of subject-specific, highly curated things like that. And I think it's an area that publishers are certainly going to get interested in. People are going to be taking their own models. They're going to be taking, the open source code base, and they're going to be putting in their own content, and they're going to be tuning it for various types of use cases. Just in the same way that, you can search the open web using Google, but also there are specialist products like the ones Michelle talked about, like the various Medline versions, or there's the ACS's Chem Search or whatever it's called, and various types of discovery platforms and databases that various societies and publishers and libraries sort of create. So yeah, I think that there is going to be a similar sort of expansion in the area of people creating specialist language models for specialist purposes, and some of those are going to work in interesting ways. They're going to be linked out to the database directly. So there's a really an interesting application that emerged maybe last year, maybe this year, that came out of Nigeria, and it's called ChatBawa. That's Chat BAWA, and you can look it up and download it and put it on your phone if you like. And it's the reason behind its creation was to push back against the large amounts of disinformation that were associated with the Nigerian elections. And what it does is it uses a large language model, but it also directly references citations. So you can ask it about some rumor that you've heard or some piece of disinformation or fake news, and it will tell you the truth about that, and it will point you to the sources. So that's a very specific use case for basically pushing back against misinformation in the political sphere. So I expect, yes, we're going to see more things like that, people using these models for specific use cases to solve particular problems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Andrea, I think you were going to. Did I see?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. I just wanted to comment in really quickly to follow up on what Phil Jones said, and I think these applications are really exciting. And I wanted to say that complementing on what I'd said previously, you can create your own GPT if you have a ChatGPT Plus subscription, and of course that's really basic, but basically you can train the model on any document that you have, or you can just input your comments using no code, and that's really easy and that's really helpful. For example, Michelle earlier said that there's a firewall problem if you want to train or if you want to access any materials on the internet that is behind a firewall or not open access. I can bring my own example to the table. For example, I recently created a Stata Assistant GPT because I use Stata, the software analysis, the analysis software for basically anything when I'm doing statistical analysis. But ChatGPT isn't really useful if you're asking for assistance. So what I did is I manually uploaded the Stata 18 user guide, and now I get useful help from this GPT that I kind of created myself when doing my statistical analysis. And that's something anyone can do. You can create your own version of it for any use case that you can think. So it's kind of here already, all of these applications, and there are no code. So it's really easy if at least if you have a ChatGPT Plus subscription, which is relatively cheap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess it's I guess when I was originally thinking about the question, it was around things like whether we'll have subject-specific, I was going to say databases, but I think applications would be the better phrase to use. But I guess what you're both describing there is thinking much more about the application of the tool rather than the subject area of focus, let's say, and regardless of whether there's one tool, like, well, not one tool, but ChatGPT is a dominant tool, let's say, it might not serve the purpose that you're actually looking for from an application perspective. And so, yeah, not everyone wants to look up a haiku in open access, I guess. So we need a range of different services. So, yeah, Fran, do we have other questions from the room?
I think there was one directly to Michelle, but I think she already replied to, which is great. Thank you, Michelle. This was a general Has any panel member tested some of the AI tools for querying patents? There are several commercial patent databases that are behind paywalls, but how good are AI tools when querying publicly accessible databases, for example, SPACEnet, USPTO, WIPO, etc.? Thank you. Jean-Francois?
Anyone feel specialist on patent? And
no pressure.
that's perhaps one we can try.
Maybe we can table this and we can find somebody that can answer that question for you.
No, I'd be interested to find out, to be honest with you, because it's patents are a tricky one. There's lots of I've been involved in projects in the past trying to use patents as part of the research graph generally, because they're an obvious sort of downstream impact of research, right? People do some research, they invent a thing, and then they do and then they put a patent in. One of the things that's a little bit tricky about them is they're remarkably unscholarly. They don't follow the same sort of citation norms that research articles do. They're quite sparsely cited and all the rest of it. So they're actually a bit sort of strange and hard to contextualize. So I'd be interested in seeing how well these models that sort of might process the text and extract information from it might do well. They could do a lot better than traditional approaches, potentially. Obviously, I'm guessing, I'm making it up as I go along at this point. But certainly, when I was working at Digital Science, one of the things that we used to do was mine literature for things like word frequency and proximity in order to understand what the topic map of the research was. So that's not using the keywords like mesh or FOR or Web of Science codes or whatever it happens to be, but actually looking at the content to get the topics to emerge from it, which is sort of flipping the whole idea on its head, creating the taxonomy from the content rather than mapping the content to the taxonomy. So it'd be really interesting to see how well that works in patents, given the fact there are quite a different form factor to traditional research articles or indeed grants. So yeah, really interesting area. Sorry, I don't know anything concrete.
I think the other interesting aspect, I guess, with patents, which touches on a point which we were talking about earlier on, is like, the implications of misinterpreting a patent can have huge financial implications, if you were to infringe on a patent and not knowingly do that. So I guess, coming back to the point of whether you can rely on AI to accurately, I don't think I'd want to walk into a court case where I'd infringed on a copyright of one of the big technology providers on the basis that ChatGPT told me it was okay. And so, yeah, I'm sure that's one of those where human interpretation becomes, or confirmation, let's say, is probably quite important.
Absolutely. There have already been lawyers who've gotten themselves in trouble, haven't they, using legal citations that were created by ChatGPT. I think it was an American lawyer who was fined a significant amount of money because he hadn't checked the evidence that GPT had created for him and was citing cases that simply did not exist.
Yeah. Okay, I think I have just my curiosity actually. It's just, do you often talk to other people involved in your work when it comes to AI? So for example, for Michel, now you heard Andrea's point of view as a researcher, as a clinician, how he uses AI to, do his work, to aid his work. And Andrea's heard how Michel, all these things she's thinking about when, doing her job. And then, Phil's point of view at industry level. And then Patrick with his own company, try to find a way to use these tools to aid, publisher, for example. I just wanted to understand, like, what is your connection with your research or your library, and if this kind of panel gave you like a little bit of a understanding of what's going behind the scene, in your own institution or in the industry in general, because I think that's very important for us. I don't know if Andrea, you want to start. Like, did you find any of the things that were discussed today by Phil or Patrick or Michel that you didn't know about? Maybe they've given you a better understanding of what you can do as a researcher.
Sure. Thank you, Francesca. And yes, some of my friends who are connected in today's webinar have already received a few of the links that I noted from today. For example, the language model that Michelle mentioned, or even using Medline as rather than PubMed as a source of information when querying the same database. But it's really, I mean, today was really helpful, and I think it will have a truly positive impact on the way that I do my research, because of course my institution, we pay a lot of attention to the methodology of the research and how we do it, but we don't really rely on the librarian when we're querying databases. So I'm truly thankful that that I participated in this panel as an active member of the discussion, and I hope that the attendees could also bring home a few key messages that are going to help them in their everyday life.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. That's really great to hear. Okay. If anybody wants to share anything else, or if Chris, if you want to wrap up, I think we are at the end of the journey.
I was trying to think how to summarize this. I think, I mean, first of all, it's been a really interesting conversation. If I could keep this, I'd like to keep this going for much longer. I think we could really got into a lot more detail on a lot of these topics. It does feel like, you know, within Sphere, it's still early days. Already we're seeing applications that change the way that we can work within publishing and health sciences publishing. I think we also very lightly touched on how the wider application of that, and Phil, you mentioned the point around research assessment as well, which are things which perhaps would build on some of the things that we could have within publishing as well. So I mean, for me, it was just a really interesting conversation. I'm really grateful to all of our speakers. I think every time you get to speak to experts on this topic, you come away learning something more, and I feel much more knowledgeable for having been part of this session. And I hope I did the topic justice. It was last minute as a moderator, but I found it incredibly interesting. So perhaps, Fran, should I say, is it for me to thank all of our panelists who I think have been fantastic, and we're really grateful for you being part of this discussion. And yeah, I hope to see you cross paths in the future and continue conversations.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your inputs today. And thank you, Chris, for stepping up and moderating the session very last minute. And we wish, obviously, Daniel to get well soon. And for everybody else that is still connected, obviously, you will receive the recording, the link to the recording of this session. And also, I will now share my screen so that you can see where you can register to receive information about the next event in the Karger Conversation series. So thank you very much to everybody here today, and until next time.